Welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. Today we're doing part 2 of an episode we started last week, which was Philosophical Apologetics. I'm joined by Dr. Rod Rosenblatt, Dr. Scott Keith, and Dr. Dan Dean. If you didn't listen to part 1, if you're just jumping in this week, I highly suggest that you go do that. We do about 10 minutes of introduction at the beginning of that episode as to why we're doing Philosophical Apologetics. We let Dr. Dan Dean, who is an honored guest on the show,
Philosopher Dan,
talk about himself and what he does at Concordia University and what he does at 1517 Legacy. So we're going to jump right in this episode so we have as much time as possible.
I want to give the same preface I gave in the last one.
Go for it.
Under whom did you get your PhD at Florida State?
Important.
Dr. Michael Roos.
Dr. Michael Roos.
Why is that significant?
Because he's an atheist through and through, and he balls out the new atheists for saying dumb arguments, but he's a thoroughgoing atheist, and think of what it means that Dan won his PhD under him. That speaks well for him. It really does.
Damn for Dan.
Yeah, and you managed to stay with us here.
Stayed with us, that's right. Yeah, I didn't get derailed off the tracks.
All right.
Well, I think it speaks well. Any professor that will do that with a dissertation that goes right to the heart, again, what he holds, and grants the degree, God bless any university professor like that.
Yeah, again, autobiographical backgrounds, right? So it was Roos was an easy pick when I got to Florida State. Not because of who he was and his kind of status in the field of science and religion and things like this, but Roos was the closest I've ever seen in a kind of agnostic, atheistic community that does like this infamous back deck that we hear about with Dr. Rod Rosenblatt. I mean, every week
I don't know if our listeners know about the back deck.
Oh, well, they go read some other blog posts on it or whatever. But, but just short, Rod used to, gather students and friends and just people around on Saturday nights, and we just sit down and cook some food, have a couple drinks, and just talk, right? And, Rick Ritchie actually talks about it in blog posts considering the consolation of the brotherhood and things like this, consolation of the brothers. It was that kind of mentality. But Roos is doing that on an agnostic, atheistic side. So I showed up to his house upon first meeting him. He was having a barbecue and the beers were flowing and people were just talking about everything and nothing at all at the same time. And I was like, oh, I know this. This is home, right?
Yep.
So it was fun. I enjoyed my time there at Florida State.
So we're going to talk more about philosophical apologetics. To catch you up, last week we talked about the cosmological argument and the ontological argument for the existence of God. The philosophical arguments for apologetics are typically about the existence of God, right? They're not typically specifically about Christ.
That's what we call the kind of classical arguments, yep.
So we're going to continue that today, and we're going to start with what is Dr. Keith's and mine favorite classical apologetic method, and that's the teleological.
Favorite of these, of course.
Yes, not of apologetics as a whole, but as in the philosophical category.
All right.
Yeah.
And it's as a whole with a W.
Right.
Right.
So what we did in the last episode, if you hadn't listened, is we just give Philosopher Dan an opportunity to lay out the argument for us. He does a good job of doing both the positive side of the argument and what we've been calling the deep underbelly, the dark underbelly of it. Where its weaknesses lie. And so I think this week, again, we'll just give you the chance to do the same thing. So tell us about the teleological argument.
Sure. So the locus classicus on this one is 19th century England, right? We go right to a guy named William Paley, who basically presented. He wrote a book called I forget the actual full title. They made god awfully long titles back then. and Natural Theology or something
and it was
like that.
published 1 year before Darwin's Origin of Species,
Right.
and it fell stillborn from the presses.
Yeah, it was. There's plenty of reference to Paley in Darwin's Origin.
Yep.
So the book, I think, is Natural Theology or something.
I think so.
Right? You can look it up. If you William Paley, Natural Theology, you'll find it, right? But he basically the famous way this is introduced to all kinds of students of philosophy is through a story of somebody walking on a heath. Now, I don't even know. I didn't go to England. I don't know what a heath is.
I think it's a sandy hill.
A sandy hill?
Yeah. Like a dune, a sand dune?
Okay.
Yeah.
So he says, he asks you to imagine. He says, if you're walking out on this heath, you're walking along, and you kick a rock. And you look down, you stub your toe, you look down and say, ow, that kind of hurt. But you're not going to question the fact that the rock is there, right? But you walk further down the beach, you kick a watch, right? And so you look down and you
A fine Swiss-made pocket watch.
fine Swiss-made pocket watch. You look down, you pick it up, you say, "Oh, right." Immediately in my head, I'm going to jump. Somebody lost this, right? You're already your whole kind of thought process is in tune with some kind of agency, right? There had to be something that lost it, and then also as you pick it up and you start, and this is where Paley goes more. You start looking into the details of this finely made watch, right? The gears and the mechanisms, you're going to realize that this had to have been created. It's not going to be something like the rock that was just sitting on the beach from time immemorial. It had to have been something that had been at a very distinct time came into being or was created by something.
With a mind.
With a mind, right?
For a purpose.
For a purpose, right? Because all the pieces turn at the right, the right degrees and things like this so that the watch works, right? And he then kind of upscales this and says, now think about the biological kind of organs that we have, and his famous one is the eye, right? And the eye actually has a long history. This goes way even back before Paley. That people like to talk about the complexities of the eye, and then it goes even into the future, post-Darwin, right? They were still talking. One of the things that current evolutionary science, not current, but 20th century evolutionary scientists really spend a lot of time on is trying to, how does something like the eye evolve? But that's not necessarily necessary for our talk here. But he says, look at the eye. You pull out the lenses, you pull out all these little pieces, and it definitely looks like it's kind of tuned to do something. It's everything is coming together so that this thing can see, and that just doesn't happen, right? You have to have an architect, you have to have a blueprint, you have to have something. The classic find a cause, a telos, right? A purpose that this thing was designed for. And Paley says it's obvious who that is, right? It's God, all right? And so this kind of puts into play this teleological argument, teleological being kind of the study from first cause or study from purpose or study from meaning or something like that.
On the street, many will call it the argument from design.
Yeah, because the thing, we look around into the natural world and what we see is infinite evidence of design.
Although I like purpose, I think better because design is good and shows a designer, but purpose adds another layer to that something wasn't designed to do nothing, that there is a telos, right, a final goal, that there's meaning to its creation.
Yeah, and I think you'll find people that will kind of interchange with the way they're understanding design, whether it's a kind of just a more like a craftsman who's kind of making something, or if they're going a little bit deeper to the actual functions of the pieces and talking about what they're made for, right? An eye is made for seeing. An eye is also very intricate in its design, right?
Right. Well, even finding the fine Swiss-made pocket watch on a heath, I think the inference is that you not only pick it up, you examine its complexity, and because I think it even goes into like cracking open the back, looking at
All
the
the
jewels,
little
the balance, the gears, and if
Sure.
you've ever looked at the back of a pocket watch, it's a pretty good example.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
Sure.
I have one. You open up the back of that thing and you go, oh my God, this thing's like 120 years old.
Right.
And it's just, it's an amazing feat of engineering.
Sure.
Really, at the end of the day. But if you were to encounter that for the first time, I think it's a reasonable inference to say not only would a normal person be sort of struck by the complexity, but would also start to try to figure out
Why was it made?
Yeah, why? And maybe you wouldn't get an answer to that, but I think that, again, it's reasonable to infer that with something so complex that there's some purpose that it serves, that it's just not, random complexity that you're encountering there. And I think that is powerful. It certainly, I don't think, is a necessary leap from there to salvation in Christ, which is again one of the problems with these arguments. But it's powerful if the end of the day the sort of barrier that you're attempting to move out of the way with somebody who you've been evangelizing is this idea that there couldn't be a God or something out there that designed and caused everything.
Right.
When I was in college way back when and was a bio major, one of the things they had recently cracked was how do bees communicate? That was brand new experimentation. And it was sort of amazing when you watched a film that showed how they had done what they had done. And come to find out, the bees who had found the goodies came back to the hive and did a dance that told the rest of the bees the direction, how far, how good was it. And you go, holy smoke.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, and this stuff is getting downplayed now, not downplayed, downscaled into the micro,
Yeah.
right? Because the latest, what I include things like intelligent design within this genre.
Sure.
If I'm going to use it for an argument for the existence of God, it's going to come into the teleological. It's going to come into the design aspect of the classical arguments, right? And they're the things they're talking about in terms of cellular development and the way our proteins fold and blood cascading, meaning which is what has to happen so your blood scabs, so you don't bleed out by just nicking yourself, right? These biological, again, mechanisms seem to be insanely purposeful, right? And insanely complex, right? So I think the number. I was just reading Douglas Axe's new book, Unbelievable, which is straight out of Discovery Institute. And he suggested that, your proteins fold in a very peculiar way. And if they don't fold, and don't ask me what exactly he's talking about, but just your proteins have to fold so that you can do transcription and translation and all that kind of stuff to make new DNA code. It has to fold in particular ways, right? And he says it's one of these obscene numbers, like,
Sure.
10 something times 10 to the negative 58th
Yeah.
or something, right?
Yeah,
Which,
the numbers.
You think back to the day and you're like, okay, so I got to add 58 zeros to what? That's a number that I can't even comprehend.
I
right?
became a theist in a course in vertebrate embryology taught by an atheist. And it was along these lines.
All right.
We used a pig embryo, serial slices of pig embryo, and there was a matter of hours in the gestation period of a pig when certain three folds had to occur.
Right.
And if they didn't, in that window of time, necessarily, that pig would be born without a central nervous system.
Right.
And I said to myself,
Yeah.
All right.
I watched it again. I said in the last episode, we're recording on the same day, so don't get confused. I covered for Kurt Winrich, who came on a couple episodes ago and did Apologetics to Young Adults down at Faith Lutheran in Capistrano Beach. He and his wife, Debbie, have for years done the high school youth group and Sunday morning Bible class. And they basically do apologetics with those young adults every Sunday.
yeah, prep them for college.
Right. And so today we were watching The Case for the Creator by Lee Strobel, and I was breaking along the way. And eventually in that, it's a book and a video. And you can find in more detail even, I think it's called The Privileged Planet, also a book and a video. And they do some of this. I mean, they get to it. I mean, they do Kalam's cosmological argument, but they get to this kind of stuff too. And I can't give you the numbers because I'm not good at remembering numbers. But at the end of the day, what they start to discuss is that the design that requires our existence, or you could even just say the existence of an intelligent life, a sort of large scale intelligent life that can self-reflect and all of those things. The design that's required as far as like gravitational pull, placement from distance from just the right size sun with just the right size moon, keeping it just the right axis and keeping the tidal waves under control and just the right gravitational force to deflect. I mean, they do all of this. And then placement in the galaxy has to be just right. I mean, it's to the nth billion.
The superscripts are very
Right.
large.
It's I don't even remember what they say. It's like 100,000th to the billionth, and I'm going. They're putting the zeros on the screen, and literally it's one with like 3 lines of zeros across a 6-foot screen in this room, and you're going, holy cow. But it's kind of interesting. They then kind of flip it around and they say, so now, and this is more the Privileged Planet stuff. They say not only is it completely unlikely for this to happen randomly, so much so that you can almost get to the point of functional impossibility, right? That it's too nearly functionally impossible or completely improbable that our position in the universe is such that having become, these self-aware beings and the improbability of that on this planet, that we're positioned as such that being self-aware, we can contemplate our existence and the existence of what might have created us, because we can look out into the heavens and see the magnitude of the universal creation, where if we weren't in the exact place in our galaxy, the exact distance from the sun with the light, and that it would be completely impossible for us to even look at the heavens and consider these classical arguments. And I thought, and again, they do the one with the lines of zeros on the screen, and I'm going,
Yeah.
holy cow.
Those cosmological constants, they call them, right? And they go down to actually just the spin of the electrons and the protons and the neutrons.
It's amazing.
Right? If those things were off by not even a nanosecond, we're talking about things lower than that, right? Everything would fly apart and we couldn't be here.
It's just amazing. And I think to myself, so that's the pocket watch on steroids to me.
Sure.
And or even the example of the eye on steroids. It's just blows me away. I've heard one other person say that the chance of something as complex, just even not with all it would take to sustain us here on the earth, but just the chances of something as complex as the human body coming into being randomly is akin to believing that a tornado would blow through a junkyard and construct a fully operational 747 that you'd be willing to get on in Portland and fly to Frankfurt.
Right. Yeah.
Right. That's the argument's probably at its strongest when we're dealing with in the biological sphere. So it's not what you were just talking about with the cosmological constants and that kind of deal, but the one with the kind of tornado coming through. That's usually in reference to kind of like, where does this info come from that my DNA is containing, and the way that the DNA gets manipulated to give me cells and to give me livers and to give me brains and eyes and all this kind of stuff. That there's always this question of where that information came from. And I've heard it put as strongly as this, that when you get to those numbers of 10 times something times 10 to the negative 58 or whatever it is, that sure, it's logically possible, but it's actually physically, there's not actually enough physical matter in the universe. So it's logically possible, but it's physically impossible.
Let me mention the name of someone who did some of this, double doctorate fellow, the elder Wilder Smith. He lectured in Southern California. He was head of NASA's drug program and all sorts of things. One was in genetics, I know, and the second one, I'm not sure. But he was uniquely equipped as a Christian philosopher to do some of that, and was solidly grounded on the earth in pretty complex biology. A.E. Wilder Smith, it was hyphenated. And now his son is doing some of the work at Strasbourg at the Apologetics Institute, but it was the father years ago, and his spokesperson called me and said, would you like him to lecture at Christ College? I said, you bet. I don't know if they filmed that, but that was a good sort of instantiation of this done well.
Right. So dealing with the kind of the structure of the argument, and this argument is another example of an a posteriori argument. Right? So it shares that with the cosmological argument. We're dealing with something that we observe in the world, and then moving backwards to say that there's no way this could have come from nothing. Right? There had to be something that designed it. In this case, and so it's also an argument from analogy.
Sure.
Right. Because we move from watches to eyes, from eyes to designer, right? So,
Yep.
so the watch obviously had to have a designer. The eye obviously had to have a designer, right? The universe looks too well put together to just come. It looks like there had to be a designer.
Right. Here I'm going to recommend an opponent, David Hume.
Yes, that's where I was going. Yep.
Go find David Hume on his critique of all forms of the teleological argument.
Right.
And you'll smile as you read this, and you should smile.
Yes.
Dr. Montgomery's line in the Tractatus is, all you end up with is a cosmic oculus.
Yeah, that's right.
But Hume, take a look at why he thinks all of this can't be done, because for one reason, the world or the universe is less like a machine than it's like a tomato.
Right.
Take a look at what Hume's objections are.
The book is Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, and it's short. It's small. The chapters are short. It will take a little philosophical getting into, but it is written in a dialogue format. It's not quite at the genius of kind of Platonic dialogues, but it as far as dialogues go, it's a pretty well written dialogue. But he attacks this idea of how much we can push
Sure.
the analogy.
Sure.
Right?
We know what it is for a carpenter to build a
Right.
house. We do not know what it is for a God to create a universe.
That's right. So it leaves so that he humorously,
Yes.
in many cases, points out some things that we might be committing ourselves to if we're gonna follow through. I mean, I think what he's trying to do, and this is speculation because he didn't say it this way, but I think he's saying, well, look, you want to give me an argument from empirical data, then you got to follow the data where it goes.
And I would generally agree with that, but I think that it's been a while since I've read Hume on this, but I remember thinking at the time, this sort of gut recollection of thinking at the time, his critiques are best against like a solid form of Christianity than they are against a possibility of a designer. In other words, if I remember correctly, he takes it to sort of the Christian argument more than just to possibility of a designer, as shown by
Correct.
by the probability of design meaning designer.
What he does is he's going to challenge. Basically, he's going to say that you can't fill in any
Right.
of the characteristics
Yep.
And
of
I'd
the
agree.
designer, except
You've never seen a cause
Right.
in your life, and neither
Well,
have I.
Right.
that's coming from that, right? But he is willing at the end to say this looks pretty. I mean,
Right.
I'm going to give you that there might be something there.
Right, and I'd agree with that personally. I mean, I don't think you can't get very far with this, but you can, if the only question is it at least, am I at least not an idiot if I hold to the idea that there's probably something behind the curtain pulling the strings? Yeah, and I think that's at least in the modern conversation, that's kind of the point sometimes is
Right.
that you're, what we're trying to show is that holding the position, whatever, the theistic position maybe is, doesn't commit you to being an idiot.
Right. And I think often the cosmological and the teleological are probably the two most popular forms of the
Right.
classical arguments that are
Years
still
and years ago,
kicking it.
Moody Films, Sermons from Science. And they were doing these two in popular form. It was day of film, color film.
8 millimeter.
Yeah, maybe 16, but 8, surely 8, at least 8. And renting them or selling them to parishes. And it was exactly the sort of thing we've done last episode and this one. It was called Sermons from Science.
I wonder if anybody's digitized.
Yeah, that'd be nice. I would like to see that. Sermons from Science.
Yeah.
All right,
I like the title.
I think we need to roll into our break. Yeah.
Yeah, it's time to take our break, so we'll be back in a short second. Welcome to our break. Today we're going to talk about an audio series that we've talked about in the past that I believe is the natural complement to what's going on here at the podcast right now, and it's called Sensible Christianity. It's a group of lectures done by John Warwick Montgomery in Apologetics. It's roughly the order in which we're going in the show right now in our Apologetics series. And for those of you who love the 45 minutes each week but are looking for more and just can't wait to get to the next episode, there's over 15 hours of content here in the Sensible Christianity series. So if you want a supplementary, if you want to learn more, if you like listening while you're in the car, this is a perfect thing to go to. So Dr. Keith, can you talk about that series a little bit?
Sure. Again, this is Dr. John Warwick Montgomery. It's an audio series. It's for download at shop1517legacy.com. It's only $49 at the end of the day, and for that much content, you're really paying for like $3 an hour.
Yep.
I'm
$3
always
an hour.
appealing to pastors, get one copy and put it in your church library. Turn it loose that way.
And I mean, the titles of the different lectures are defending the defense of the faith, apologetics as evangelism, purpose of apologetics, do's and don'ts. We've done many of these. He does 2 on the existence of God, which so part 1 and part 2, each about 45 minutes, which sort of doing what we're doing here, but it's Montgomery, so up a notch. The problem of evil, introducing the case for Christianity, reliability of the New Testament documents, evidence for miracles. The Bible, is it the Word of God? Jesus Christ on the Old Testament, 2 parts there, which I actually really like because one of pretty much the way we get to the inerrancy of the Old Testament is based on Christ's view of the Old Testament itself.
Amen.
And so Montgomery does over an hour on that, which is just invaluable. I also think last night, again, I was down in Sherman Oaks, and teaching, and basically all I did was 2 hours of questions and answers. I mean, I just sort of said, what's your question? And inevitably, if you open yourself up to sort of open questions and answers like that, you'll get somebody asking you the problem of evil. Long explanation short, the problem of evil is if God is all good and God is all powerful, why does he allow bad stuff to happen? Difficult problem to answer. I always encourage, when I'm talking to actual people who are possibly actually evangelizing and doing apologetics, I always encourage them to kind of put on a little bit of a pastoral hat with that one, because there's two types.
It's existentially loaded.
Right, and there's
my mother died and
That's
just
right.
8 days ago.
That's right. In my mind, I've been asked it by two types of people. One, sort of like academically minded people who know it as a philosophical objection or asking it as a philosophical problem. But more typically, when I'm asked that question, I'm asked by somebody who just lost someone. Right?
Yeah, somebody hurting.
In fact, I said last night, I was once asked this question by somebody who lost their father as like a 15-year-old, moved in with their uncle, who was then a great father to her, and lost him 2 years later.
Oh.
And it broke her. And so it was I encourage people to go that way. But if you're looking for sort of the answer to the philosophical / theological problem, Montgomery's is the best I've ever heard in this series. And because he goes through, I mean, he not only answers the question, but he sort of like poses the next question and answers that question, then poses the next question and answers that question, because you can kind of get down some rabbit holes with
he goes down 4 levels.
Right. It's just, it's astounding. And so he does that. That's a great series.
Another thing that's good for people, I'm thinking the Christian author, philosopher Miller, whose text I use. I used to use atheistic texts because they were just better written, but Miller does well. I think it's important, if we're giving people some recommended source, Miller gives most of the Christian answers to the problem of evil, and some of them are embarrassingly awful.
Right. Well, I'd say Montgomery's 30 minutes in Sensible Christianity. It's only 30 minutes, right? He goes 4 levels in 30 minutes. I've used that time and time again. And again, I'd encourage our listeners to be cognizant of who's asking the question and why they're asking it.
Sure.
Before you just send somebody down a philosophical path on this one. But if you just sort of want to know the background, or if you have that question yourself, oh my gosh, it's astounding. The series ends up with, is Christ relevant today? What about evolution? Hour and 4 minutes on what about evolution there in Sensible Christianity. And a world for those who think with their feelings. So, and then hour and 20 minutes on that, sort of
It's just, and it was designed for the laity.
Oh, yeah, it's really
He
good.
gave this in parish after parish after parish, all over the U.S., and it was always designed for the laity.
I'd say this, along with what we advertised in the last show, the Tractatus, probably the two most influential things.
History, law, and Christianity.
Yeah, and then I'd add in history, law, and Christianity as just like the explanation of the evidential argument.
Yep.
So,
Very good. That'll be in the show notes and on the website. You can find it at www.thinkingfellows.com. You hit the episodes tab, and it'll be right there under this episode, which will be called Philosophical Apologetics Part 2.
all right. Good. So, Philosopher Dan, we're looking at doing one more today, and we'd like to go over the moral argument. Anytime I think of this one, I go straight to C.S. Lewis, Book 1 of Mere Christianity, or the case from what
Problem of Pain,
Yeah.
or I'm sorry,
The Case for Christianity.
Case for Christianity.
And in some sense, the abolition of man.
Oh, you have it separated from...
Yes.
That's wonderful.
This is the nice way.
Yeah, where it sits on its own, because somebody looks at that and says, I could read that this weekend.
Right. It's short. It's only 28 pages to cover that essay where he does the moral argument for the existence of God.
Right.
Then he does another, I think, 30 pages on like basic Christianity, the basic tenets of Christianity. This is a Case for Christianity by Simon Schuster, Touchstone Books. So if they, I don't know if they're still doing it separated out this way.
Yeah,
I will look for it on Amazon, but I think that a different publisher has control over
all
it.
of his stuff is now coming through.
Well, that's wonderful.
Starts with an
because
H.
I always have reservations recommending Mere Christianity because some idiot at English Macmillan
Macmillan is what most of the stuff comes from.
glued three books together that originally stood on their own, even in hardback. And somebody looks at Mere Christianity and says to himself, maybe next vacation.
Right, too big.
But what you're showing me, where it's the case for Christianity on its own, I know the reaction to that.
Yeah, you can still get this edition, Dan, and it's through Broadman and Holman. We'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, it's on Amazon, so I'll have it up on the website. Yeah.
And buy more than one, you'll give them away.
Yeah, they have them. I think they have them used and new, so you have lots of options there.
Perfect. Yeah, he is, philosophically, the moral argument is not one that is discussed often.
That's correct.
In the pure philosophical realm.
Yep.
Right? Most questions when you're dealing with morality and religion are going to be of the kind of Euthyphro nature. Do we need a God to have morality?
Yep.
That's more of a some technical language, some fun language you can impress your friends with. That's more of like a meta question, right? That's meta ethics, right? You're talking about the ground, the foundation of ethics,
Sure.
right? Lewis, on the other hand, and there are some people in the philosophical world that do it. Actually, Immanuel Kant does kind of have an argument
Absolutely.
from morality, are working actually from a moral consciousness or something.
Sure.
Right? I know that I've done things wrong.
Yep.
Right? And I hold people to certain standards.
Well, what was it he called it when he finally yanked it in the back door after having thrown it out the front door? It was a hypothetical at the end.
Oh, you're talking about Kant.
Yeah.
This is a practical postulate or
Yes.
something like that.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
after doing all the work he did against all of the arguments for theism, he knew he had to somehow have something, and he called it a hypothesis or
a postulate.
postulate of pure practical reason.
Practical reason.
Not pure reason, pure practical
Right.
reason. But the popularizers of it, if we named them, Kant would be first, and Lewis would be next.
Yeah, because the idea is essentially, and it cuts through. I mean, you can already, when you're dealing with morality, we've been so enculturated to think of kind of pluralism.
Oh, yes.
Culture X, culture Y,
Sure.
culture Z. Your anthropologists at the college aren't doing you any favors on this one.
Margaret Mead.
Who turns out to have,
The whole thing was
it was a fib.
Yeah.
Right. So if you go
Coming of age in Samoa.
right, that was it, Samoa. Yeah. So, ironically, I mean, this is again an aside. I was at a Rod, you'll love this. I was at a conference on virtue. Virtue ethics, and there was some anthropologists there though who were talking about how actually the vision in anthropology is starting to shift. They're actually no longer looking at the differences between culture, but they've realized that there's a lot of similarities between culture. In terms of they weren't thinking about kind of necessarily moral behavior.
Oh, I understand.
But they were saying that when we look back to it, actually, there's a lot going on in culture that's more similar than we once thought.
Well, Lewis.
Right.
And Lewis was
Lewis nails
on
that point.
Yep,
Yeah.
he was.
He was on that.
I love
before.
the background to the case for Christianity too, in the radio talks and sort of one of the rationales behind that being sort of justifying the
When he talked about the Tao.
right.
Yep.
Sure, there's a lot of variation, but there's no culture we know of who, rewards cowardice in battle.
Right.
You can have any woman under any circumstances, anytime. You'll look a long time and you won't find
Right.
those.
Right.
And what he was arguing was just what you said.
Yep.
So Dan, let's do the argument and then let's have some fun with Lewis here.
All right. So Lewis, I'm just going to go with what I remember from Case for Christianity, right? Because Kant, you're going to get lost in stupid language. that
Usually
we don't need. But Lewis essentially says, look, you make judgments, right? You hold people. So Lewis is, and this is what's great. It's just fantastically simple. He says, you make judgments about other people, right? What warrants you to make those judgments?
Sure.
Right? There's going to have to be something more.
Yep.
And here's the kicker. You fail
Yep.
in your own standards that you
Yep.
set for what those moral things are.
Your own behavior and thought will condemn you.
That's right. So we might say it's a feeling of guilt or something like
He
that.
uses the illustration of being completely relativistic, and then somebody at the carnival picks your pocket,
Right, and the
and you yell out, "Come back here, you thief! That's
Right.
my wallet."
oh, I love the one too, and I think one of the things he says is that the two conclusions that you can sort of come to about morality is not only that right from wrong, but secondly, that you know you don't hold to the right
That's
standard.
right.
Yep.
And I think that's kind of mind blowing. It just if there's that's sort of universal within all of us. The other example that he uses that I love is the I gave you a bit of my orange, why won't you give me a bit of yours, right?
Yeah, the
and
fair.
there's a whole background to that of when he's writing this during World War II in the UK, and when they got an orange,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
This was they're under food rations
Ration
at this point.
supplies.
Treasure.
And at that time, if you got an orange and you actually shared your orange with your buddy, and then the next week you see your buddy and he's slopping down an orange and he doesn't give you any, you're going to actually be really upset because
Yeah.
you've been living on canned food for the last 2 years.
Yep.
Right. So it's the combination of the fact that we do hold people to standards and that we feel and experience failure. I mean, it goes a little existential with that one, but the fact that we kind of feel the failure, that we know I'm not holding up to some sort of standard.
Romans 2:14 and 15.
And this seems to be rather universal across cultures.
Yep.
And he deals with the pluralism question, that you're not going to go to these other cultures and find where this kind of thing isn't happening. That suggests there's got to be something behind the world. There's got to be something of absolute good. There's got to be the good that's behind it, this thing that is kind of guaranteeing and actually making sense of, because you can go the materialist route and try to explain it all away instinctually or something like that.
Sure.
Wittgenstein says hopeless.
Yeah, yeah. Wittgenstein.
Hopeless.
Oh, I forgot to look up that quote because it's great. It goes something like this. Wittgenstein says something like, "If there were to be a book of ethics, it would explode all other books."
That's right.
Right.
That's
because
right.
you just can't get it. Right. You can't get it from within. I
Yep.
think Montgomery says water doesn't rise above its own level.
Or G.E. Moore, the naturalistic fallacy. There are some things by which you could really have normative ethics, but polls aren't it. What are people actually doing won't get you to what
Right,
should they be doing.
Right. And that's what the students always bring up when they read this, right? And you ask them, what do you think about it? Because we have them read this in core theology. It's one of the first things they read. And when you start asking them about it, one of the things that a lot of them will bring up is they lose the we don't live by these things that we know are right, right? And so they kind of just get lost in we can't actually know what's right, and what's right isn't, there's no symmetry between cultures. And if you press them on it, it's kind of funny because I often, you can almost see right through the fact that they're expressing the reality that they're doing something themselves in their lives that I probably hold is wrong, that they think is okay. And I think I always tell them you have to go higher than that, right? You have to go to a higher level. It's not that of course there are people within every culture who would have thought that fornication is okay or who had affairs or whatever. What he's saying is that if you go to the higher level, there's really never been, that we know of, a culture where it was just simply okay for me to go and take your wife and drag her into my bedroom and have my way with her. That's sort of unheard of. And if you kind of get to that level with them where it becomes closer to like force and whatnot, they think, oh my goodness. And sometimes it's funny, the more astute students will even bring up, maybe when it comes to murder, that there are cultures who have engaged in sacrificial killing. And I always point out to them, well, that's different though than me deciding I don't like you and bashing you on the head with a rock.
That's right.
Whether or not sort of the system of the government that's in place has decided that to appease our deity, we have to say whatever. That's totally different than me just deciding that I'm going to go kill whoever I want, and that killing, that murder, being accepted by my culture. It's really fun to watch them sort of work through these processes where people who when you get into this conversation, actually, I think, believe that morally they're completely relativistic people. Begin to discover that perhaps they're really not.
Yeah.
And the explanation, I'm just a child of my tribe or culture, quickly runs out of fuel.
Right.
Right.
Intellectual fuel.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, Lewis, in The Case for Christianity or Mere Christianity, or Chapter 1 of Mere Christianity, or whatever, where it is in that text. He likens it to learning like mathematics, because
Correct.
one of the
Yep.
one of the things that I get from the students is always, well, this is just, it's my culture, and what they mean by that is this is just the way I was raised.
Sure,
so it
that's
was
what they
taught,
mean.
It was taught
Right.
to me.
Yep.
And his turn of phrase is just great, because he talks about, well, yeah, you were taught mathematics too, but that doesn't make mathematics relativistic, does
Right.
it?
Yeah, it's universally
When
acceptable.
he brings these as akin to natural law, right?
right.
And he actually says that the ancients, when they discussed natural laws, they were discussing this as much, if not more, than say mathematics or the movements of the heavens or something like that.
That's hard for the modern student
Right.
to even imagine.
And this is what they were talking about. And it's just brilliant.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's got it's got legs. I mean, when you think about the critique, so what's this kind of slimy underbelly or something like that, or where's it going to go wrong? Here, I was talking to Dr. Rosenblatt before we started. The philosophers are always going to go whether or not you need something like a god
to have it.
to make moral laws necessary, right? And the first place they're always going to go, and I don't think it would work with the pure kind of Lewisian argument or even the Kantian argument, but they're always going to go to Euthyphro. I mean, if you bring up morality to anybody who's had just a tincture of philosophy, I guarantee in 101 they probably looked at the Euthyphro dialogue, and the Euthyphro dialogue is supposed to separate the need for God to be the foundation of morality.
Yep.
And it makes it one way. I mean, just briefly, the kind of the dilemma goes like this. It basically asks the question: is something holy because it is loved, or is it loved because it's holy? And the idea is, is if it's loved because it's holy, that means that the standard of holiness is outside of the gods or the forms. It's outside altogether. Or if it's holy because loved, then it's a kind of pure, it's God loving something and making it holy. Now, most Christians would probably go down that path, that what is good, just, and beautiful is what God says is good, just, and beautiful.
Yep.
So
Right.
deontology, or divine decree.
Divine decree.
Yeah.
Divine
Yep.
decree.
Yeah, divine
Yep.
decree. Ironically, I think what Lewis's argument does is it shows, not within Christianity, but it shows in kind of any sense that it's going to be something outside of the gods themselves, right? It's part of the natural law, right? So I think it opens up, the moral argument, according to Lewis and Kant, opens up a response to the dilemma that means we don't have to necessarily get down into the divine decree situation.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Remember, if you're dealing with Plato's Euthyphro, that this goes way before Christianity, and then in a way, it's a question like, have you yet stopped beating
Right.
your wife?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
I mean, both take your money and pay your money and take your chances. No matter which way you go here, the distinct possibility of getting clobbered has already been worked out over
Right.
thousands of years.
Right. But it will be where a philosopher or somebody who's had a little bit of philosopher, when the moral argument is raised, they will often go to the Euthyphro, right?
Yeah.
So,
Now another one from Wittgenstein. If there were ethics, we would have to have a book from heaven to do it.
Right. That's the one I remember.
and that book would explode all other
Interesting.
books.
And in that too. And that book would explode all other books
Yep.
in the world.
Yeah.
One of
He
the
had a humility about him.
That's
that
right.
In the field was just amazing.
Yeah.
One of the things I do like about the way Lewis approaches this in the Case for Christianity is it's a starting point, right?
Yeah.
And he doesn't go too deep into what you might call sort of a developed normative ethic based on
No.
this. What he goes into, I think, more precisely, and it's a setup for getting people to Christ. Really,
Sure.
it's what we'd call the law.
Well, look at his audience. It was kids who were going to die in the cockpits
Right.
of their Spitfires.
And one, he's trying to give them purpose for what they're doing.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the lines is how are we to tell the difference between ourselves and those who we're
Yep.
going to fight?
Yeah.
Sure. Sure.
How do we judge our cause?
Sure.
And I think that's so. I think it's important to do a little bit of just context into how this came out, why he did it.
Well, as Churchill asked him to do it.
Yeah, and it really opens it up. It opens it up to be sort of just this wonderful little tale. We need to finish up, but one of the things we're going to throw in the show notes. I'm a fan of those newfangled chalkboard drawings, which I'm
right.
sure are passe now. Since I think they're newfangled, they're probably on the out. But there's on YouTube, somebody has put together, I think, almost the whole of at least book 1 and parts of book 2. of the case for Christianity in those narrated by some English guy that sounds a little bit like Lewis in those chalkboard
I
drawings.
think I've seen that.
Those aren't
Yeah.
passe.
I've-
People like those.
I've
stuff.
shown you at the old
Yeah.
house. We went through some of them.
Yeah.
I mean, if you know, I know for a lot of people, it's reading is sort of daunting just with time and everything. But these are, you could listen to these; they're free. You could watch them. The drawings are exceptional,
Yeah.
and we'll put those up in the show notes.
You know that the BBC lost the tapes?
Oh, jeez.
They
Really?
did. He did it every single night at RAF base after RAF base after RAF base after RAF base. Did it for the people of England during the Blitz. And they never lost the tapes on how to grow turnips in your English backyard. Those they never lost.
Yeah, those are in archives
But
somewhere.
they
Conspiracy theories.
they did lose Lewis doing the case for Christianity.
Yeah, I'm sure they have the tapes on where the ladies can turn in their nylons for parachutes too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got a great side note story after about, but something else. But it's isn't it true that the Four Loves, his recording of the Four Loves, or at least his recording of notes of the Four Loves, is the only extant recording of Lewis reading something he wrote?
Almost, yes. Now, ask Rick Ritchie for the little others that can be found, but that is almost on its own. It was sold by the Episcopal Radio Corporation over the years. I got it in cassette form, which means analog, and my order for it as a digital disc has been at Amazon for 6 months.
Oh, you can get it on iTunes if people want to download it. The Four Loves, you can download it on
can you?
iTunes. Yeah,
Yeah. I'll put
I
that
wanted
in
the
show notes.
discs.
yeah. I'm sure the disc is harder to get at this point.
Yeah. For sure.
So.
All right. Thank you for listening to part 2 of Philosophical Apologetics. Hold on tight. We're going to have Dan on for another episode somewhere.
We're just
down in the
working on
future.
timing.
Yeah, we're just working on dates. But thank you for listening. Please remember to subscribe using your favorite podcasting app, whether that's iTunes or something else. And go like us on Facebook and Twitter so you can follow the show
Review
and never
us.
miss a beat. Review us on
Yeah,
iTunes.
we need
Help
some
us out.
reviews. Yeah.
All right. See you next week.